Hello everyone, I'm here to read you the very final chapter in George's Marvellous Medicine. I can't believe that we've come to the very end already. In the last couple of chapters I read to you, George and his dad made a couple of more medicines, different versions unfortunately. They didn't quite work the same as the very first medicine that George made, and some very strange things happened to the chickens that they tested it on. And the last medicine that they made the chicken turn into a tiny, almost like a chick. So, this final chapter is called Goodbye Grandma. Have a listen. "There's still something you've left out," Mr. Cranky said. I can't think what it could be," George said. "Give it up," Mrs. Cranky said. "Pack it in. You'll never get it right." Mr. Cranky looked very forlorn. George looked pretty fed up too. He was still kneeling on the ground with the spoon in one hand and the cup full of medicine in the other. The ridiculous tiny brown hen was walking slowly away. At that point, Grandma came striding into the yard. From her enormous height, she glared down at the three people below her and she shouted, "What's going on around here? Why hasn't anyone brought me my morning cup of tea? It's bad enough having to live in the yard with the rats and the mice, but I'll be blowed if I'm going to starve as well. No tea, no eggs and bacon, and no buttered toast." "Oh, I'm sorry, Mother," Mrs. Cranky said. "We've been terribly busy. I'll get you something right away." "Let George get it, the lazy little brute," Grandma shouted. And just then the old woman spotted the cup in George's hand. She bent down and peered into it. She saw that it was full of brown liquid. It looked very much like tea. "Ho-ho!" she cried. "Ha-ha! So that's your game, is it? You look after yourself all right, don't you? You make quite sure you've got a nice cup of morning tea, but you didn't think to bring one to your poor old grandma. I always knew you were a selfish pig." "No, Grandma," George said. "This isn't—" "Don't lie to me, my boy," the enormous old hag shouted. "Pass it up here this minute." "No," cried Mrs. Cranky. "No, Mother, don't. That's not for you." "Now you're against me too," shouted Grandma. "My own daughter tried to stop me having my breakfast, tried to starve me out." Mr. Cranky looked up at the horrid old woman and he smiled sweetly. "Of course it's for you, Grandma," he said. "You take it and drink it while it's nice and hot." "Don't think I won't," Grandma said, bending down from her great height and reaching out a huge horny hand for the cup. "Hand it over, George." No, Grandma," George cried out, pulling the cup away. "You mustn't. You're not to have it." "Give it to me, boy," yelled Grandma. "Don't," cried Mrs. Cranky. "That's George's Marvellous—" "Everything's George's round here," shouted Grandma. "George this, George that. I'm fed up with it." And she snatched the cup out of little George's hand and carried it high up out of reach. "Drink it up, Grandma," Mr. Cranky said, grinning hugely. "Lovely tea." "No," the other two cried. No. But it was too late. The ancient beanpole had already put the cup to her lips, and in one gulp she swallowed everything that was in it. "Mother," wailed Mrs. Cranky, "you've just drunk 50 doses of George's Marvellous Medicine number 4, and look what one tiny spoonful did to that little brown hen." But Grandma didn't hear her. Great clouds of steam were already pouring out of her mouth, and she was beginning to whistle. "This is going to be interesting," Mr. Cranky said, still grinning. "Oh, now you've done it," cried Mrs. Cranky, glaring at her husband. "You've cooked the old goose." "I didn't do anything," Mr. Cranky said. Oh, yes, you did. You told her to drink it. A tremendous hissing sound was coming from above their heads. Steam was shooting out of Grandma's mouth and nose and ears and whistling as it came. She'll feel better after she's let off a bit of steam, Mr. Cranky said. She's going to blow up, Mrs. Cranky wailed. Her boiler's going to burst. Stand clear, Mr. Cranky said. George was quite alarmed. He stood up and ran back a few paces. The jets of white steam kept squirting out of the skinny old hag's head, and the whistling was so high and shrill it hurt the ears. Oh, call the fire brigade, cried Mrs. Cranky. Call the police! Man the hose pipes! Too late, said Mr. Cranky, looking pleased. Oh, Grandma, shrieked Mrs. Cranky. Mother! Run to the drinking trough and put your head under the water. But even as she spoke, the whistling suddenly stopped and the steam disappeared. That was when Grandma began to get smaller. She had started off with her head as high as the roof of the house, but now she was coming down fast. Watch this, George, Mr. Cranky shouted, hopping about the yard and flapping his arms. Watch what happens when someone's had 50 spoonfuls instead of one. And very soon, Grandma was back to normal height. Stop! Cried Mrs. Cranky. That's just right. But she didn't stop. Smaller and smaller she got. Down and down she went. In another half minute she was no bigger than a bottle of lemonade. You can see how small she's getting. This is Mrs. Cranky, and this is Grandma. How do you feel, Mother? Asked Mrs. Cranky anxiously. Grandma's tiny face still bore the same foul and furious expression it always had. Her eyes, no bigger now than little keyholes, were blazing with anger. How do I feel? She yelled. How do you think I feel? How would you feel if you'd been a glorious giant one minute and suddenly you're a miserable midget? She's still going, shouted Mr. Cranky gleefully. She's still getting smaller. And by golly, she was. When she was no bigger than a cigarette, Mrs. Cranky made a grab for her. She held her in her hands and she cried, How do I stop her getting smaller still? You can't, said Mr. Cranky. She's had 50 times the amount. But I must stop her, Mrs. Cranky wailed. I can hardly see her as it is. Catch hold of each end and pull, cried Mr. Cranky. But then Grandma was the size of a matchstick and still shrinking fast. A moment later she was no bigger than a pin. Then a pumpkin seed. Then... Where is she? Said Mrs. Cranky. I've lost her. Hooray! Said Mr. Cranky. She's gone. She's completely disappeared. That's what happens if you're grumpy and bad-tempered, said Mr. Cranky. Great medicine of yours, George. George didn't know what to think. For a few minutes, Mrs. Cranky kept wandering around with a puzzled look on her face, saying, Mother, where are you? Mother? Where have you gone? Where have you got to? How can I find you? But she calmed down quite quickly, and by lunchtime she was saying, Oh, well, I suppose it's all for the best, really. She was a bit of a nuisance around the house, wasn't she? Yes, said Mr. Cranky. She most certainly was. George didn't say a word. He felt quite terrible. He knew something tremendous had taken place that morning, and for a few brief moments he had touched with the very tips of his fingers the edge of a magic world. And there you go, there's George looking a little bit confused. That's the end, the very end of our story. Thank you so much for following and listening to me read this to you. I've had a great time being silly and putting on voices for you. And I hope that this inspires you to read a few more of the Roald Dahl collection. He's written many, many stories, and I know that if you enjoyed this one, you'll enjoy all his other books as well. So happy reading, and take care. Keep smiling, and hopefully we'll see each other soon. See ya. Bye.